Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Pre-Medical and Pre-Dental Advising Office's Secondary Applications Workshop. We do thank you for joining today. We realize that secondaries probably aren't the first thing on your mind right now, but hopefully this recording will come in handy in the future when you are beginning to think about that down the road. This session is being recorded. It will be uploaded to our website under the usual workshops and chat with alumni series page. In addition, if you have questions throughout, you can please drop them in the chat box, but just make sure you address them to everyone so that both Erin and I can see them. With that, I would like to ask my colleagues to introduce themselves and or say a couple words. So maybe Erin, could we begin with you?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin Saramboli. I'm the Director of Pre-Professional Advising here at UConn, and I get to work with our amazing team of advisors, including Krista and Dr. Sanford.
Would you like to say a few words of welcome, Dr. Sanford?
So thanks for joining us, Drew, Ethan, Jerome, and Priya, and others to follow. Great to chat with you about this next step in the journey.
Thank you. So here's the game plan for today. This is traditionally probably the shortest of all of our workshops, so please just sit back and relax, and definitely we invite questions if you have any. I'm going to begin by just talking about a couple housekeeping things, make sure people are in the loop, and then we'll dive into the basics about secondary applications, timelines, and then look at some very specific sample questions to just start your thoughts about how you might approach these. You will find our contact information at the bottom of the screen, as well as a very shameless picture of my dog again, because it was just her birthday 2 weeks ago. Okay, so hopefully, or you probably found out about this workshop because of our other spring workshop series. This is the last one. However, for the time being, that is, we will be offering more interview related workshops and mock kinds of things a bit later in the summer. And if there's interest, we might even do something else related to secondaries, since, like we said, this probably is not the first thing on your mind right now. We have our ongoing Chat with Alumni series as well, so I just want to highlight our very next event. It will be the third out of 4 events for this semester. It's going to be focused on LGBTQIA+ in healthcare on Monday, March 29th at 6 p.m. And so we actually have 4 alumni joining us today, all from the Rowe Scholars Program. I'm sorry, joining us later this month. And they're going to do something a little bit different than we've done in the past, having some breakout rooms to talk about different experiences. In addition, just making sure you're all familiar with the major names and faces you'll see associated with our office. You can find out more about bios and things from our 2022 cycle application orientation recording. Okay, and then related to that, if you are going to be a 2022 cycle applicant, just be aware of some of the helpful links on our website. So we have all the kind of consolidated step-by-step instructions and processes listed at the timelines page. I put the full link in there, as well as recordings of all of our other workshops and the Chat with Alumni series at the second link. We've also been updating a lot on our website recently, so increasing the information under the different application component tabs, as well as some acceptance and matriculant data for the 2020 application cycle that you can refer to. Okay, so we're going to dive right in here, beginning with what is a secondary application? And you're going to hear me throw out the words primary and secondary just to keep it shorter. So whenever I say secondary, I'm just referring to a secondary application. So the format for a secondary varies, but it usually consists of 1 to 2 additional short essay type questions. Usually one of those questions is related to a school specific question. So for example, why our program? Why do you think you would be a good fit here? What about our program really entices you? You might also see something called the Casper test down the road, or something else similar called the situational judgment test. Some schools use these in lieu of a secondary, some use them as kind of a supplement to their secondary. And so we do talk more about those at our later interviewing workshops as well. Just want to put that on your radar though, in case you've never heard of either of those before. And within the secondary application, this really provides you with an additional chance to further differentiate yourself from other applicants and really talk about what sets you apart, what makes you a unique applicant. It's always good to know as well that schools might use your secondary responses to ask you to elaborate and talk about why you're a good fit for a particular program at a future interview. So just to clear up any confusion as well about what is the difference between a primary and a secondary. So I like to think of the primary as really the common application. So each application service, depending on the type of school you're applying to, they have their own application service, and otherwise known as the common app for that type of school. And you only submit that once. And so all schools receive the exact same info on that primary application. The secondary application then is a school-specific supplemental. So try to think back to when you were applying to undergraduate institutions and you might have had to answer some supplementals. That's essentially what a secondary is. And so both the primary and the secondary application are individual application components along with your standardized testing scores and then your letters of recommendation. Those are really the four major application components. And as we talked about at the application orientation session, typically a school will not touch your file at all until they've received all four of them. So they do arrive, they're submitted, they arrive at different times, but the school will generally wait to hold off reviewing you as an applicant until they've received all of them. You also, I'm just going to give you a pop quiz here. So where are you going to find the personal statement on your application? We had our personal statements workshop this past Friday. So hopefully you were able to answer. Your personal statement is found on your primary application. So in other words, the same personal statement is sent to all the programs you're applying to. And as we talked about on Friday, the AMCAS application service for MD programs actually calls it the personal comments essay. So same thing. These are just a couple more specific definitions, explanations. I'll go ahead and give you a second to read those over. And so I think as the AMCAS example highlights here, they really can run the gamut in terms of very short and or very time intensive, slightly frustrating and annoying as well. We will look at some other examples down the road. Okay, so where do you submit secondaries? They're very typical for MD programs. It's really all but a few Texas schools require them. Do recall that a lot of the Texas state schools, they have their own primary application service called TMD SAS, which is separate from AMCAS and AACOMAS and ADSAS, those other ones. DO and PA programs are generally similar to MD programs, and dental programs, it varies. So some of them require some kind of a supplemental secondary, some of them don't. Usually a good way to gauge whether a school requires one or not, or whether you will be receiving one, is to either go on their website and or check out your application services main explorer. So for AMCAS, that would be the MSAR tool that we talked about also at our Selecting Schools to Apply to workshop. On the DO side of things, there's the Choose DO Explorer. And then on the dental side of things, there is the Dental School Explorer. So usually each school entry will indicate whether they require a secondary and or supplemental depending on their language, and then you can find out more about that there. So when will you receive secondaries? This does largely depend on when you submit your primary application. And so this is another slightly frustrating element because it really is completely school specific whenever you receive them. Some of them you're going to receive very, very quickly. In fact, it could be as soon as you click the submit button on your primary application, you're automatically going to receive one from certain programs. That's not very common, but we do hear about it occasionally from a couple schools every cycle. Typically, you would be receiving one about 1 to 3 weeks after your primary application is verified. Almost always within 3 months, but it is still possible to hear back anywhere from February through April. That's not common, however. So for the most part, if you do submit your primary application in the early midsummer, you'll probably be hearing back from most schools with their secondary applications sometime mid-July throughout August as well. And so, bridging off of that, just to show you some more concrete steps here. So the first thing, you definitely have to make sure you submit your primary application. And using AMCAS as an example, AMCAS is going to open on May 3rd this year. That's when you can begin filling it out. However, you cannot click submit until May 27th. And so that is the very first day that AMCAS, the application service, will begin receiving and verifying applications. The verification process does vary depending on the point in the cycle. It can typically take anywhere from about 2 to 6 weeks. I have a visual in a couple slides here. But regardless, no applications are sent to the individual schools this year until June 25th at the earliest. So in other words, no school will have anyone's primary applications or applicant information until June 25th at the earliest. Okay, and then when it's time to submit those secondaries, it is also good to note that they do typically require an additional fee. This really varies depending on the school, but I would say probably $100 is most typical. So we do see anywhere from about $50 to $120 per school. This is just an added consideration because we do want you to feel as prepared as possible when applying, because it is such a time-intensive and costly endeavor. If you are receiving some kind of fee assistance from one of the official programs, occasionally schools will allow you to waive their secondary fee too. So that's also a good thing just to check in program by program. And then after that is a lot of waiting for interview invites. Okay, so just first of all, pay attention to the visual down here. This is an example of how long it typically takes verification for AMCAS. And as you can see, if you do submit your application as early as possible, those last couple days of May into early June, verification typically takes a very short time compared to in mid-late summer when the majority of applicants are submitting their applications and it just takes significantly longer for AMCAS to verify them. I do want to note again that every year we're very, very surprised that ADSAS, the dental application service, verifies applications very, very quickly. It's typically within a few days, which is just mind-boggling. So if we have any pre-dents, please, try to submit your applications much earlier rather than later. Now, whenever you do receive that secondary, whenever the school's timeline is for sending it out, I mean, the ultimate goal is to get it actually submitted within a few days of receipt. That becomes a challenge, however, if you are going to be receiving about 20 of them at once. And so you do have to think critically and really prioritize your most important schools. We recommend strongly as an office that regardless of the program, you submit the secondary application within 2 weeks of receipt. This does not matter if the school tells you that you have a full month to submit it or even longer. We say ignore that and really try to get every single secondary in within 2 weeks of receipt. The reason for that is that some schools actually use your submission time to essentially gauge your interest in them. It's a little bit tricky. And so if they see that you're taking a full month to submit your secondary, they might take that as a sign that you're instead using that time to prioritize other school secondaries, and they're not exactly your top type choice of program. So that's something we will remind you about down the road as well. I just want to ask Dr. Sanford, do you want to add anything to the timelines here while we're on the subject?
I can maybe just add a couple of comments, Chris, to give folks a little bit of sense of history and some of the maybe do's and don'ts. So cut me off if I'm cutting into the other slides coming up, if you would. So just so you have an appreciation of the history, there used to be no essentially standardized primary or secondary applications. Each school had its own individual application, so you ended up filling out an individual application to each of the schools that you were going to apply to. So thank goodness they've arrived, as with other uses, including undergraduate schools, a standardized application, for you to fill out at the beginning. Saves a huge amount of time and effort for you as an applicant. And as Krista mentioned, think of the 4 items as entirely separate units. You have a primary application, that you do through the application service. You have secondaries that's going to be sent to you from each school, and you respond to each school. The MCAT or DAT, that release date, is about, a certain amount of time after you take it. So that has to be at the school. And finally, the letter package or the letters you're submitting have to be in essentially before any school looks at you. But all that has sort of been made possible because of standardization over the years. So you're not putting as much, dedicated time and effort to preparation of really separate applications for each and every school. So that part of it's been streamlined. Used to not be any fees basically associated with applying. Once you submitted your application to a school, that's all you needed to do. Each school had a little bit of a fee, but there wasn't any, sort of language about primary or secondary or anything. What's evolved over the years is the secondary fees that schools receive basically are used to essentially cover the costs of, the admissions office, the admissions staff as it operates, to handle applications at schools. It's just realistically how the sort of finances work at the schools. A couple of other things. Most of the secondaries, when they come to you nowadays, they just give you an entry access to their own computer. So you actually go in and fill out, with a password, the information right into the application, because it's all, done sort of all done electronically now at schools. I would say things not to do. You don't want to copy and paste anything from your primary application into your secondary. You don't want to copy and paste one secondary to another secondary. I recall often seeing language in secondaries that actually referred to other schools rather than, the medical school at Connecticut where I was. So you just want to be careful. It's a good idea not to leave it blank. Some schools just say, well, don't tell us anything else if you have nothing else to tell us. It's good to be sort of thinking about amplifying and just updating, making some additional sort of elaboration in some way on applications. As Krista noted, some of these are really short and to the point. Maybe have a couple of questions. They limit it to maybe one page or X number of characters. Other schools can have somewhere up to 12 or 14 different questions, and you feel like you're taking a test when you go ahead to turn in your secondary. Good idea to think about some drafts, once you have your primary sort of buttoned up and sort of ready to go. These are, Krista will show you, there's some available, and a lot of schools sort of use them year to year. So you can access and actually put together at least some drafts before you even get the request. So you can more efficiently go ahead to get those in. An important element, I think, of this process that we should just highlight a bit is, and when you go ahead and submit the primary, you download that, of course, in May. The first you can submit is late May, early June. What you need to be a little conscious of there is it's a good idea to try to have your transcripts sent in so that they're sitting at MCAS before you actually click to submit your primary. The reason for that is if one of the checkers ends up pulling up your file to check your transcripts against what you've entered on your primary, and your transcript isn't there, you get bumped. And you could get bumped for a while, just because it sort of goes in a queue, and you may not come up in a while to get looked at again in that queue. So you also don't want to request the transcript before it's actually ready. So if your grades are not going to get posted to your transcript till something, like May 25th or 29th or so, you may want to just hold off, submission of the primary few days, until actually your transcript arrives there. So when they go to pull up your primary to check it, the transcripts are there. If you've also got transcripts from other schools, that's typically the main reason why review of primaries gets held up. If you have courses from other schools that you've taken, you basically got to send another, an official transcript from that school as well. That's just one of those little sort of things at the beginning, many people forget about it, and it ends up delaying, completion and certification verification of your primary, at MCAS or one of the other services, sometimes, 2-4 weeks, sometimes a couple of months. So it's just one of those little things at the beginning to pay attention to. So, school fees, again, we talked a little bit about. Another thing is automatic versus preliminary review. Often, applicants have the question, well, do I automatically get a secondary, or does the school actually review my record first and decide whether or not they want me to submit a primary? So in most instances, it's an automated process. Schools usually will send out, that notice to you. Part of that is it's tied with the secondary application fees, and they're expecting, such and such a percent of the pool to move ahead to complete their application and, work on the sort of fees received there. There are a few very selective schools that do preliminary assessments and then may not request a secondary. So that's just one about most of the schools do, and most of them do that as an automated process. The schools that send you it before they even get the verified primary, what ends up happening is the MCAS typically sends out an address label, to a school. So they're basically working off the address labels, even though they haven't even seen your application yet. So that's a way for them, just to get their request for your secondary out early and to perhaps get it back a little early. So we just add those few things at this point, Kristen.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up that last point about kind of screening rounds too. I was just going to say that next, actually. It's really, to my knowledge, some schools in California and possibly Texas that might do that initial kind of screening round. But otherwise, you should largely expect to receive a secondary from any program you apply to, just based on the fact that you're submitting a primary application there. Okay, and here's just one example along with some cute pets filling out secondary applications, I can assume. For one of our applicants who last year submitted their primary application kind of in late July, early August, I can't remember the exact date, somewhere around there. And so just showcasing that her primary, she was notified that it was actually verified by AMCAS on August 24th. And then she received her first school secondary only 2 days after that. That was pretty fast. She received her second one on the 31st, and then she received her third one in early September. So it really does vary school to school. I apologize, by the way, sometimes when I share these slides directly within WebEx, the formatting gets a little bit messed up, but when we upload the slides to the website directly, you'll be able to see the finalized slides. Okay, just a couple of quick notes about acceptances. So you typically would be paying a deposit to a program within 2 weeks due to rolling admissions, but it's really, really important to read the school-specific instructions. A lot of MD programs, in addition, will allow you to actually pay deposits at multiple schools, which can be refunded. This is not the case for a lot of DO programs. So you do need to absolutely read those instructions very, very carefully. Typically, you would have to commit to one school if you have multiple acceptances by April 30th, and then withdraw applications from other schools by then as well. You might also hear the term down the road passive withdrawal, which essentially means that for whatever reason, perhaps you just didn't have the time, the energy, you didn't want to spend the money, and or you just decided you weren't really interested in the program after sending your primary application to them. You passively withdraw from a school by essentially not completing their secondary application. Okay, and that is actually one of the kind of the official language that AMCAS uses when it comes to that. All right, so now we're going to transition into some sample questions. And as Dr. Sanford mentioned, a lot of schools do not change their secondary questions year to year. And so therefore, you can be very strategic about this, do a little bit of digging, research on the internet, and actually look up typical questions year to year. And there's a pretty good chance that you'll be seeing the same question on your own application for the 2022 cycle. So these are just some very general guiding reflective questions that you might start considering. that will likely appear on at least one or a couple secondaries that you see down the road. Again, oftentimes they're related to kind of unique personal characteristics, attributes, those competencies, things that will really set you apart from other applicants and you would bring to the table as part of an incoming admissions class. Okay, one good thing to note is that beginning last year, continuing into this year, MD programs have, for the large part, just directly added a question about the impact of COVID on your preparation experiences to their individual secondary applications. For DO programs, this type of question was actually directly added to the primary AACOMAS application. So that was just a slight difference between the two, and just letting you know that you will have a forum to explain, for example, if you had some really great plans and then the pandemic canceled them, and or any other challenges, things that you had to adjust to and demonstrate resilience. Okay, so these are the typical UConn School of Medicine secondary questions. And as you can see, there's the added one about COVID. I would say this is a fairly typical example. Again, 1 to 2 kind of short essay type questions. One of the questions focusing on why us? Why are you interested in our program specifically?
I wanted to add something to regarding the final prompt here. I think that it's important to address COVID if it has impacted you directly. And I think it's impacted us all in many ways. And please feel free to share that and do share that. But you don't need to use the whole 1,800 characters if you don't have enough to share in that space. So just share what's appropriate and how it has impacted you.
Thank you, Erin. Really great point. And in addition, we often get a question, if a question is optional on a secondary application, should I still complete it? If you have some kind of a response that can directly answer the question and would provide additional valuable information to the admissions committee, we do generally say it's better to include an answer than not if something's optional. Next, I'd like to highlight UMass's secondary questions because we certainly have a lot of applicants there. As you can see, this one takes a slightly different structure and largely focuses on the competencies. In fact, they're basically asking you to explicitly describe how you have demonstrated these competencies. You do have a little flexibility in choosing which ones to respond to, however. Okay, so 3 out of 6 prompts. 150 to 200 words. And then here's part 2. There's even more. I would draw your attention to the final 2 as well. What is your greatest strength? Okay, and then if you're currently taking a gap year, or as we call it, a growth year, what are you currently engaged in? That's the kind of question you'd likely be asked at an interview as well. Now, hopefully by seeing some of these sample questions already, some of them might look a little familiar to you. So just keep that thought in the back of your mind. I always like to throw in Harvard's for fun. So they have kind of a similar, what have you been doing since graduation? And they give you a fairly large character limit as well. Here's an example of a Texas school. Again, largely focused on personal attributes, competencies. Here's also an example of one of those optional questions I mentioned. So if you have a compelling and thoughtful response, it's probably better to include one than not to include one. Here are just a few others. Write an autobiographical statement. Yeah, I've seen that on a couple secondaries, actually. A lot of times DO programs are really interested in knowing that you have explored the DO philosophy, you're familiar with the core tenets of osteopathic medicine, and so just be prepared to talk more about that and touch on what experiences you've had that demonstrate your connection. A common PA kind of question might be describing the role of the PA on the healthcare team. And in fact, no matter what type of school you're applying to, it's really good to be able to answer that general question about, can you actually describe what this type of healthcare professional does as part of a team? Okay, and then there's a final example from dental. Okay, lastly, we're actually in the home stretch here. So just to share a few tips and tricks now. Make sure you're talking about why this program. So as Dr. Sanford mentioned, you do not want to be copying and pasting your answers because that could just lead down a very bad path. And if the school clearly sees that you've done that, that could not work well in your favor. Okay, and also you want to give a really genuine response in regards to the specific programmatic elements. You don't want to just say, because this school is convenient, it's 10 minutes from my house, something like that. That's kind of an extrinsic factor. So look for more of an intrinsic factor about why the program is a good fit for you. Okay, and then similarly, so how does this program give you different opportunities to make an impact in all these different realms? Finally, make sure that you're answering the question that's being asked. So double, triple check as you're writing your responses to just looking back up at the actual question and make sure you're really clearly answering what's being asked and not going off in some other direction. Okay, as we also alluded to, don't repeat information, simply regurgitate your resume. They already have that information, they have access to it. So talk more about things like what you gain from particular experiences. Similarly, so think of the secondaries as the continuation of a conversation, not the start. You likely have touched on many of these things already in your personal statement and other aspects of your primary application. So this is a chance to further elaborate and set yourself apart. Have many other people proofread it from a variety of angles as well. And then as we talked about, the importance of time management. So if you do happen to be one of the lucky people who receive 20 of them at once, because that's just the schedule all of your schools are on, make sure you are prioritizing the programs that are most important to you. Get those submitted ASAP. And then regardless, take no longer than 2 weeks to submit any of them. So this is where it is really, it's a great idea to try looking up some of these questions ahead of time, perhaps after you've submitted that primary application. And while that's in the process of being verified, you can spend a lot of your time beginning to draft these secondaries so that you can have a really fast turnaround time when you do receive them. Here is also just another shameless attempt to share pet photos of my dog and Aaron's 2 cats. You might remember them as the dentist cats from the application orientation. Okay, the final things I wanted to mention. So if some of those sample questions that we shared did look familiar to you, perhaps that's because you remember filling them out in your applicant portfolio. This was on purpose. We spent a lot of time this year doing some digging and research into common secondary questions, especially for programs in this regional area, and other typical things you might see on them, just so that you can treat this applicant portfolio as, you know, kind of your first efforts to get some words down on paper and then use it as a test run with us as well. So hopefully you will see many similar questions down the road that you can refer back to your own responses to when you begin to draft them. We do have a dedicated space on our website under the application components tab with a little more information about secondary applications. So please check that out. And in addition, this is kind of an unofficial resource, but Prospective Doctor has a database of different secondary questions that you can refer to get a sense of what some of these might be for the schools that you're applying to. So again, we disclaimer, because it's not an official resource, but it's just a good compilation to give you a sense. All right. At this point, I would invite Aaron and Dr. Sanford to provide any additional comments they might have. And for the people tuning in, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat right now as well.
So go ahead, Aaron.
I don't think I have any specific comments other to say than that this is really your opportunity to, like Krista said, continue the conversation and show what you learned about the school and why you think it would be a good fit. And the other part is having others proofread. It's just like a personal statement. The more eyes, the better, just to avoid any fatal errors that could hurt your candidacy.
Thank you. I just add a couple of things. When admissions committees sort of get your file and read it, in what order do they read things? So from my experience, typically how people start is they look at your personal statement and read that. They want to be intrigued enough to read on. They then turn to the secondaries and read through those and see what you've chosen to amplify on. Then they do a pretty sort of rapid skim of the entire application, looking at academics, looking at research, looking at clinical, looking at service activities, any unique extracurriculars that stand out. And then we'll zero in on basically the letters and, some summary comments and may look at some letters in somewhat more depth. But that's basically the sort of order. So you can see you want to kind of make sure you grab people's attention with the first two things on the list, which is your personal statement and your secondary apps. Note about the secondary apps, it's a good idea to look beyond the admissions information on the website or what a school is saying just on the admissions page into the more student-oriented sections of the school's website, because there you find a lot of more detailed information about different clubs, meetings, and different service opportunities at the school, so that when you're constructing your secondary response, you often sort of are searching, well, how am I going to tell them that this would be a good fit for me? It may well be a good fit for you because you'll be reading about some of the special kinds of things that the students are involved in related to their own clubs, related to their own service and community activities that are really important to the students that you may not find at all in the admissions section of the website. So it's a good way to target, indeed, some of your competencies and to highlight competencies specifically related to those kinds of opportunities available at those individual schools. So, I mean, it can really, it hits home to reviewers because it certainly tells them that you've looked into this at a little more depth than most of applicants actually will. So those couple of comments. The other thing I would say is schools are changing their policies a little bit with the extent to which they want to receive other information from you. When I was doing admissions, we had a pretty open policy of having applicants update us whenever they had important additions to make in their file. But what's happened in recent years, last couple of years in particular, some schools are just saying, don't send us anything after the secondary application. So they're doing it out of fairness because they can't look at everybody's sort of third, a secondary, you got a third element or more. And they just don't sort of have the horsepower and the time commitment and people commitment to be able to really do that systematically to a lot of people. So you're going to find some schools will just say, period, your secondary application is basically your last chance to give us any additional information about you. Other schools, and my sense is there's about half of the schools that are doing that now, and the other half do tend to encourage more updates. Particularly if interviewed, then they like to see some additional updates. You want to be careful about sending updates too. Make it targeted with something important as additions to say. You don't want to be sending one every 3 weeks. You've got to really pick maybe one time where you're able to convey, at least more in the context of what you want to say as updates. So we'll stop there, Krista.
Okay, I did just invite any questions in the chat box. I don't see we have any takers yet, so please don't be shy.
Just for those who may be applying MD, PhD, the MD, PhD application certainly has a different component where you have to detail your entire history and involvement in research. So that is very thoroughly done as part of your primary application. So secondaries, you then have a little more of an opportunity to maybe go into and elaborate on specific aspects of your involvement in different projects that you may not have done in quite the same way in your primary application. And some schools, will have various combined programs. So if you're interested in applying for, again, MD, PhD is a separate application. If you're interested in applying for combined MPH or MBA, some schools have other combined programs, including, law and healthcare administration and other things. So often there'll be some unique prompts related to your other sort of graduate program interest as well, that would be necessarily part of completing that. The way most schools do the other programs is you have to first be admitted to the medical school, before they actually then send your application on to, essentially be considered by the other graduate program.
I'm still not seeing any questions, so hopefully you're just all reflecting and beginning to process. But certainly this is still a couple months out, so you have a lot of time. Please don't hesitate to reach out to our office, either via email or just setting up a regular advising appointment if you've already had your applicant coaching session. Always happy to talk about specific elements too. All right, so with that, I think we will sign off for the day. And again, this recording will be up hopefully by tomorrow morning on our website. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in. Best wishes with everything.